Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Australia takes pride, and rightly so, in being a strong and mature Western democracy. Our country is built on respect for human rights, the principle of a fair trial, of justice not only being done but being seen to be done, where each one of its citizens has the right to a fair go. We hear this being said in Australian parliaments regularly, particularly by our Prime Minister and members of his cabinet, and we see these principles enshrined in domestic and international laws. Unfortunately, in the case of one of our most outspoken citizens, journalist and publisher Julian Assange, our leaders have deliberately ignored those domestic and international obligations. As of 11 April, Australia will have allowed Mr. Assange to languish for 2 years in a high-security prison in Belmarsh, while our Prime Minister and our Minister for Foreign Affairs have hidden behind talking points to avoid taking action to secure his release. While the US authorities have been investigating the WikiLeaks founder since 2011, their indictment charges remain unclear and unjustified. The use of the Espionage Act to charge Assange with computer intrusion is an assault on the US First Amendment. The US has dangerously assumed a position that they have jurisdiction over all journalists internationally, regardless of whether they are US citizens or not. Not only is this use of the Espionage Act to charge a journalist unprecedented, but it is also unfounded, considering Assange is an Australian citizen and not subject to US secrecy laws. The court hearing in London made it clear that if extradited to the US, Mr. Assange would face 18 federal charges and 175 years in a maximum security prison. But let's be honest, at its root, this is all about WikiLeaks publishing of a notorious video of helicopter footage killing innocent citizens and exposing those war crimes. Australian barrister Greg Barnes recently said in an interview with Sarah Chesser that, and I quote, "The UK courts have rightly recognised that extradition for Mr. Assange means he would die in a United States prison. This view is supported by hundreds of international lawyers and legal academics, including Professor Nils Metzler, the United Nations Rapporteur on Torture. Meltzer has indicated that if extradited to the US, Julian Assange will be exposed to torture or other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Whilst alive, Assange would be placed under special administrative measures, a misleading term to describe measures which the London court has said are oppressive and which would likely lead to Mr. Assange to commit suicide. Mr. Assange would be placed in solitary confinement, isolated from his lawyers, family and friends, and his fellow Australians, who would have no information concerning his treatment in prison. If extradited to the US, Assange could face further charges which carry the death penalty. Senior representative bodies such as the Law Council of Australia, the Council for Civil Liberties, Doctors for Assange, Amnesty International and the federal parliamentary group named Bring Assange Home have voiced deep concern about the extradition process. The ACTU executive frames the violation of Assange as an attack on journalists, journalism and the public right to know. The Washington Post, the New York Times and others would agree. This extradition attempt is a political one at its heart. Anthony Albanese has thrown his support behind Assange, claiming enough is enough and that nothing is served by keeping Assange incarcerated. Supported by Shadow Minister Mark Dreyfus, who raises concerns over Assange's ill health and welfare and calls on the government to finally draw a line and bring this case to an end. Meanwhile, the Morrison government has pledged meaningless consular assistance to Assange, claiming that the Australian government is unable, or perhaps more unlikely, unwilling to intervene in Assange's legal proceedings. With skillful diplomacy, Australia has been able to secure the release from jail of academic Kyle Moore-Gilbert and, prior to that, journalist Peter Grest and filmmaker James Ricketson. We know that Mr. Assange's health is in a precarious state, and as an Australian, he is entitled to the protection of our government. For all these reasons, the decision of the London court to reject Julian Assange's extradition is welcomed. The responsibility now falls to our Prime Minister and his cabinet to speak to our American allies and end the decade-long persecution of Assange.